Welcome to Econ Talk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. You'll also find our archives where you can listen to every episode we've ever done going back to 2006. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. I want to remind listeners that we're doing a survey for your favorite episodes of 2015. You have until January 31st, so please go to econtalk.org, econtalk.org, and in the upper left-hand corner, you'll find a link to the survey, so please vote. Today is January 11th, 2016, and my guest is James Heckman, the Henry Schultz Distinguished Service Professor of Economics at the University of Chicago and winner of the Nobel Prize in 2000. Jim, welcome to Econ Talk.
Nice to be with you, Russell.
Much of your contribution in econometrics is related to what is sometimes called selection bias. The people or data that we observe may not be like the people or data we don't observe. How much progress do you think we've made in this area?
Well, I think a lot of progress has been made. I think the initial literature was really pointing out the problem, which had been neglected by many economists, not all by any means. But it had been a problem that had been kind of swept under the rug and stayed that way for many, many years. And when the issue became sort of got into the public discussion on economics, two things happened. One was that people became more data sensitive, and this triggered responses that weren't purely methodological. It consisted of people collecting better data, which is always a very good thing to do. And secondly, it also suggested something which I think links us closely to economics, which is basically that the selection decision generally, at least if it's self-selection by agents, really involves a lot of economic considerations. And so when we think about things like labor supply, unemployment, even voting or other kinds of questions, choices were there. And so it stimulated some work also in linking economic analysis of data to economic choice analysis. So it had these two branches, I think, which are still very active today.
It's a huge problem, though, and you give a wonderful example in one of your pieces where you talk about how when we try to assess progress made by African Americans over, say, 1950 to 2000, there's some progress over the first few decades of that period, substantial progress. But unfortunately, it appears that much of that progress is measured rather than real because many African Americans are not in the labor force. They are not like the ones who are in the labor force, and so the rise in measured, say, average wages is the fact that some of the lowest wage workers are not in the data. Is that correct still?
That's correct. I mean, one of the biggest sources, of course, has been incarceration, where black males are literally taken out of the labor force. And we think that most black males, many black males anyway, who are in prison are less than high school graduates or maybe just high school graduates or GEDs, and they tend to be lower wage people, so that they tend to be ignored in the official statistics that you see reported. But it's not necessarily always in that direction. There's some evidence, for example, in the last 20, 25 years, that in fact, if you look at the wages of women, and in particular women, what was being found was actually that increasingly, starting in the 1980s, more educated women were working more. The big growth rate in the labor force participation and employment of women came among the most educated women. And it turned out that those were some of the most highly educated and higher wage women. And therefore, some of the growth of the female wages may well be a consequence of the fact that they're getting more educated women who have essentially higher wages and higher wage potential. So this problem generically affects a lot of social statistics. People want it to go away, but it's there.
Well, they like to ignore it, is what I found. I mean, I'm a big critic of the failure to take account of demographic changes in household structure.
Yeah.
And when you're using household data on inequality or home ownership and you have huge increases in single-headed households, it's inaccurate to compare over time without correcting for that, it seems to me. And yet people just happily go ahead and do it.
No, that's extremely relevant today when you think about the way that household inequality is measured. I mean, there are two different issues here that show up in a lot of discussions and just get totally confused. The one that you suggested is certainly highly relevant, namely that a big contributor to growth in household income inequality is just the growth of single-parent households. And we know that those are very, very unequally distributed. A second big factor is really just, I don't know if you want to call it a selection bias so much as a definition bias, that some of the most dramatic statistics about rise in inequality are based not on the same data unit as the household, but on what are called taxpayer units. And taxpayer units and household units are very different objects. So being careful about these definitions and making sure that we hold composition or of the workforce or whatever we're trying to measure constant is an extremely important question, I think, and still something that gets easily neglected. Very hard to explain in a single word or two, and I think just gets lost in public discussion.
On the topic of wage growth, you mentioned women. It's rather striking how men's wages have been remarkably flat, at least in some data sets, which that avoids a household issue. But for a long period of time, when productivity has been rising, when overall incomes are rising, per capita GDP is rising, male earnings are remarkably flat, at least corrected by conventional measures of inflation. Have you looked at that? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, I have. I think there's some very interesting work. In fact, it's interesting. This last week, I was at the American Economic Association meetings and gave a course on inequality, actually, with Steve Durloff. So for 3 days, we met with a group of students, largely faculty and graduate students who were interested in this question. And I looked at the latest evidence, which I think is extremely interesting and important. And namely, the discussion about the CPSU and the RS and the deflator and what exactly the true measure of well-being is.
Good luck.
Yeah, well, no. I realize it's a controversial discussion. But what's interesting is the following, that if you look at the bottom, if you look, for example, take for example, a measure that received a lot of attention. About 2 years ago, there were official reports saying that the poverty rate in the United States, if it was properly, poverty rate in the United States in 2014, say, that was the year I think this was calculated for, and you compare it back to the beginning of the war on poverty in 1964, that basically we were at about the same level, maybe a little lower, but the poverty rate was the same. However, people who calculated this carefully and realized two things. One, the progress in the true price of living, the fact that the cost of living has gone down. There's been tremendous growth in quality. If you look at so-called chain-linked indices, You're going to find substantial growth in real income. And secondly, so not only quality, but you also had real reductions in price. And especially among the basket of goods, the so-called Walmart basket, that essentially a lot of the poorer people, the less affluent people would be governed by. In other words, that's the group that essentially is probably the least advantaged among the population, and it turns out there's been substantial progress. And if you add to that additional transfers and program changes, the official poverty rate that many people, many economists, and some sociologists, even some strong advocates of research on poverty and advocates for the poor, would change the U.S. official poverty rate from 14% down to about 5%. So I think we've made tremendous progress, but it's because it's partly in the matter of dimensions that have to do with unmeasured components. And I think this gets easily lost. On top of that, we have a lot of problems with the standard data sets that we use for measuring wages and for measuring a lot of these, even consumption expenditure, are showing increasing non-response rates. And that's a real problem. So when people adjust for these things, and there are judgments made, no question about it, there does seem to be more progress and sort of less stagnation than you hear out there in the public discussion, certainly in the presidential debates. But, I mean, there is an issue that real income growth has not been uniform across the different levels of the income distribution, different percentiles of the distribution. But let's go back to one thing you mentioned at the very beginning here, Russ, and that is that if you think about selection and you look at the question that the labor force participation rate of males has been declining, even in the prime age, that this common measure that people use, the so-called 90-10, which is comparing the 90th percentile people to the 10th percentile people at the bottom, say, that the content, the composition of those deciles is changing over time. So our comparisons aren't stable. People think of a percentage, 5 percentile, or even for that matter, the median, as referring to a stable group of people. It's not. I mean, there are multiple skills, and there's been a lot of selection, and a lot of the estimates don't adjust for it. So I think the world is not as pessimistic as what looks to be the case from just looking at unadjusted raw statistics. But that's a long-winded story.
No, I think it's really important.
No, I think it's a very important discussion, which people just ignore. And I think it's become politically convenient for many people to argue, well, we're getting declining real wages. I just don't think we are getting declining real wages. I mean, there are a lot of issues, but I don't think the real wage has actually declined. And even people using census data, CPS data, the current population survey data, recently have not seen decline. So I think if you properly adjust, you actually see some real aspects of growth.
You say people are careless about it. I expect politicians to be careless about it. I'm disappointed when economists are careless about it because they're, for whatever reason, there are a lot of incentives there for either publication or to get attention or to be influential.
Well, I think that's part of it. I think part of what as you know, in any profession, I guess economists are no different from others. Making big, striking statements is really, something that's dramatic. Making a splash is really important. But in this case, I think there's a whole group of so-called poverty researchers, people who are focused on income inequality, who've just established a convention that they're going to decide that a skill level is a percentile in a current population survey distribution, and making no adjustment for the fact that the composition of those people at that percentile has changed. So it's a little bit like, the same person could be at the 15th percentile, at the 5th percentile, and yet, they're treated as these percentiles are treated as really stable objects, and they're not. And they're not describing the same people.
Well, it's not just the same people. It's that they don't have the same characteristics. So if you, just to take the earlier example, household composition at the median is radically different than it was 40 years ago. And so when you make those kind of comparisons, it's an apples to oranges comparison.
Exactly. And I think that's very common. It's a common fallacy, but I've not seen any presidential candidate, not that I followed them that closely, or any political candidate even discussing that, even qualifying.
Yeah.
Saying here the real incomes have gone down. And so there's an atmosphere of pessimism that seems to be out there that actually seems to be governing both sides of the political debate, Republican and Democrat.
Yeah, I agree. I'll switch gears. There's been a lot of enthusiasm for randomized control trials in economics.
Yes.
Particularly in the area of development in poor countries. Yes. But this goes back decades, as you pointed out, in labor economics, experiments looking at the negative income tax, the effect of training programs. How useful are these techniques, and how reliable are their findings?
Well, let me go back to give you, you are absolutely right. These are, as you know, in social science, and economics is no exception, there are these eternal cycles. People get on the bandwagon, then they get off the bandwagon, then they get back on the bandwagon, but they're new people. So the wagon keeps rolling, but the occupants are changing. I remember as a graduate student at Princeton University, enrolling some of the very first participants in the negative income tax experiment. That was an experiment suggested by research of Milton Friedman, suggesting that one effective way to transfer income to the poor, giving people incentives, would be a negative income tax. So this was viewed. There was a woman who was from MIT, a graduate student, who went to Mathematica. Her name was Heather Ross, and she actually was the mind. She and several others at Mathematica were the minds behind creating this program and trying to evaluate it. And so what came out of that was an interesting, and actually one of the great legacies of the negative income tax studies was actually modern econometrics or microeconometrics.
Yeah, it's true.
Precisely because the experiments were so messed up, and people did not understand when they were designing the experiments how much choice there was, how much attrition there would be, how much individuals would respond to incentives in ways that weren't even thought about. So the first round of experiments was generally viewed as a failure. I think John Cogan's testimony before Congress in the late 70s or early 80s kind of was the capstone of that failure, in the sense that he pointed out all of the variety of estimates and the need for using econometric estimates to adjust for the non-compliance, the self-selection, the non-response, and on and on and on. So that all went to rest. Meanwhile, the faithful continued, and there was a large group of people working largely for government consultant organizations, big companies like Manpower Demonstration Research Corporation, Mathematica still continued. And so there's been a constant faith, despite this first round, what I would call extreme failure. Nobody believed the New Jersey negative income tax experiments, and in the later Seattle experiments, nobody believed them because they were so heavily compromised by a whole set of other issues. But still, there's been this notion out there, which is popular. People understand. You toss a coin. You randomly assign aspirin to the one group and no aspirin to the other, and you make a comparison. It's so easy. It's so compelling. And it's so misleading in a social context. And I say that because it's not just development. So you get various people who've come along and picked up the banner. You know, Esther Duflo has certainly been carrying the banner forward in development, and Banerjee. And I'm not saying that experiments don't add to the data sources that we have. But I think there are subtleties. Some of these points I made in a paper many years ago, Angus Deaton, you revived some of those points in the context of development. But they really came to this, that people, when you experiment on them, are acting in a purposeful way. Here's the most striking example I can say is the recent study about the Head Start Impact Program that was put out a few years ago by I believe it's the Department of Education. And the Head Start study, if you look at it, randomly assigned people to Head Start, or at least some Head Start centers, and then denied access to others. They didn't deny it permanently. They denied it over a window of opportunity. And so the experimental results are reported. The treatment group really wasn't doing much better than the control group in the experiment. But as people looked at that study, they found exactly what we had found in earlier manpower studies and the like. And namely, what did the control group people do? Well, first of all, the random assignment generally has to be among people who are interested in taking the program in the first place, okay? So basically, whether it's a job training program or Head Start, you randomly deny access to people who apply and are accepted. That's the standard. Doesn't have to be. In the drug trials, not necessarily so. Well, what happens is people who are denied access to the drug or the job training program or Head Start will actually try to find substitutes for it. In some earlier work, we found during the time when AIDS really wasn't treatable, that when random assignments were made of AIDS trials to just what was thought to be an effective drug for AIDS patients, the patients involved, the experiment subjects involved, were so threatened that they ended up sharing their medicine with the control. I mean, they didn't. It was a blind trial, so nobody knew who had the treatment, who had the control. But treatments and controls knew each other, and they basically just randomized within themselves, and everybody got a share of everything else. So they at least got half a loaf rather than none whatsoever. So, and this was certainly true in the job training programs, where people who were denied one job training program would enroll in another. And there are a lot of substitutes out there back in the 1990s and still today. But in the case of Head Start, which is relevant, there are a huge number of other other child care programs out there, including other Head Start programs. So it turned out that a big chunk of the people who were in the so-called control group were also getting in a Head Start program, or maybe a program better than Head Start, some substitute they could find. So again, economic choice theory had its way, and the control group was heavily contaminated by this. And so a simple treatment versus control comparison was not informative.
It's understating the full impact.
Really understated it directly. It's like literally, it's like comparing. Like I have an apple. I have a Washington State apple here on the left and a Washington State apple on the right. And gee, there's no difference between apples, which is fine, but it doesn't tell you the question is whether or not the apple is a good thing to eat versus nothing. And that's literally what was going on. So I think what's happened is that there's this eternal optimism. People understand it. They think they understand it. These other questions are too subtle sometimes. People just don't want to, and they say, oh, here's the experimental evidence. And the experimental evidence, I think, is actually has to be treated with a real grain of salt sometimes, a lot of caution. And people don't. And it depends. I mean, for example, there were studies that were done in India about the effect of small lending programs.
Yeah.
And one group of people introduced into an area of India, a lending program for disadvantaged people, generally women or small lenders. And the idea is, do these programs have any effect? And that particular intervention showed no effect whatsoever. But later analysts looked into it and said, oh, wait, it turned out when that program was introduced into that particular part of India, there were 40 other programs, very comparable, already in place. So literally, there was almost there were perfect substitutes for what the treatment was. So the randomized trial was completely compromised by failing to think about a substitute. There are a lot of issues that arise with randomized trials. So I think the issue of randomization, it's a good idea. Extra source of variation is good, but you got to be careful. And I think people aren't, and I think that's been a problem with the interpretation of this data.
Well, let's look at more traditional techniques. We had Josh Angrist as a guest on Econ Talk talking about what some call the credibility revolution, econometrics, new research designs, other measures to avoid estimation challenges when we apply econometrics to microeconomics. Are you a fan of that literature and those new techniques?
Well, I would say two things. First of all, the so-called new techniques are not so new. They involve instrumental variables, which I think go back to Sewell Wright or his son, or his father, Philip Wright, 1928 or so. Secondly, and instrumental variables have been a central part of econometrics for the last 70, 80 years. So the methodology of instrumental variables is not new. I think the so-called...
Just to clarify for non-econometricians, instrumental variables are ways to try to control for the worry that causation might run in both directions, or there's a bias in your estimation because of the complexity of those interactions, right?
Right. Well, an instrumental variable is like, you can think of an experiment, like we were talking about a minute ago, as an example of an instrumental variable. So, for example, you can think of randomly assigning somebody. Forget about any problems with the experiment. What you find is that if you randomize somebody, what it does is it's neutral between treatments and controls. Any unobservables among the treatments will be balanced with those among the controls. And the randomized trial and the randomization assigns some people to a treatment and denies others treatment. That's in an ideal world. That's what an IV does, but it's not necessarily a random assignment. It's assumed, and it's a big assumption, that it balances more or less the unobservables between the treatment and the controlled. But the application of the instrument, moves people towards one direction versus the other. So you can think of randomization as just a special case of instrumental variables. So yes, sorry not to define it.
That's all right.
But I think this whole idea of the credibility revolution, it's very good. It's good for sales, and I'm very happy to see sales and consciousness. But I think the idea of the credibility, so-called credibility revolution, first of all, I think we have to properly attribute a lot of this basic thrust to Ed Leamer in his famous book written in 1978.
Yep.
He had a book called Specification Searches in Economics, where he raised a lot of questions which are still on the table today. In fact, I would say a lot of the work in econometrics about robustness and sensitivity was presaged and pretty well described in that 1978 book by Leamer, which I think is still available online. But I think the idea of the credibility revolution came from this, and I think there is some value in being aware that a lot of conventional econometric procedures, assumptions about linearity, assumptions about normality, assumptions about making distributional assumptions, functional form assumptions, were documented to actually change the nature of the empirical work that came from it. And it was very hard sometimes for people to reproduce the findings of one study by some other study. And so it became kind of a cloudy world out there, and people weren't sure what they were getting from all of these models. So I think there's some general thrust that was true in the whole economics profession starting mid-'80s, about the time Angrist and others along the so-called credibility revolutionists were starting out in graduate school, that a lot of the previous structural work had not really delivered its promise, that there was a lot of fragility. So fragility is the key here. But unfortunately, what I see is it was one of the negative sides of the so-called credibility revolution is a lack of interpretation of what's being estimated. I think the goal of econometrics, as opposed to statistics, is to ask economic questions and to answer those economic questions. And I think that means you start with a question, and the question is, why am I doing this? And what economic question am I developing? What am I really answering? So you say, take what I mentioned, Kogan's work. When I change the negative income tax, or when I make the incentive scheme to work steeper, do I get, for example, if I reward work more by paying higher wages or letting people keep more of their earnings, do I get a greater labor supply response, or do I get less? This was cast in terms of what classical economics would call income and substitution effects. Moving people towards something, compensating for real income effects, making people wealthier and buying more goods that are more desirable. Unfortunately, the credibility revolution has taken this notion that there's some missing variable out there, some unobservable, and we want to control for that unobservable to a new level, to a new extreme. So much so that there seems to be an obsession with making sure that we don't have this unobservable contaminating our result without asking the question of what is it that we're getting from this instrument, or what is it we're getting. So it's kind of traded away. So where it's more credible is that there's less bias, but it's less credible in the sense that we don't know what we're estimating. And so what's happening is that much less use of economics is being made. And as a result, it becomes very difficult to use this for policy purposes, for anything. So the high point of the credibility revolution kind of work, or the instrumental variable type of work, would be, suppose that I have a policy and I impose it in a given environment. And so literally, it's not a randomly assigned. I impose, say, in one state, a certain kind of withholding scheme on a tax payment. Say Social Security taxes. Say I do this for Georgia, but I don't do it for Mississippi, and I standardize for the differences in the ethnic and social compositions of those two states. That's going to answer a very specific and useful question. If I impose that tax in between on a certain group of people whom I studied, how much does that tax change their behavior, say retirement or labor supply or work behavior or unemployment search behavior? That will be a specific thing. But generally speaking, it's very costly and very unrealistic to imagine that every policy we're ever going to find or ever be interested in is going to be a policy that we can exactly replicate. Generally, we think that price and income, substitution and income effects, these basic economic parameters are what govern responses to policy. And the whole promise of econometrics back in the 1940s, when it was really started in a rigorous way here at the Coles Foundation in Chicago, was really to try to uncover the basic economic parameters that govern behavior. So I think that there's been a huge shift away from kind of understanding behavior and moving towards statistical artifacts that are hard to interpret as responses to economic questions. So I think the credibility revolution has been somewhat overstated, and probably not properly appreciated as having really kind of turned focus away from serious economic analysis towards something that I think is more purely statistical.
Well, let me take an example that is talked about a great deal, and I want to set it in the context of what I often hear from younger economists.
Yes.
I'll hear people say things like, well, I just look at the data. I just look and see what the data tell me. And I don't have, I don't need theory, or I don't want to use theory to bias my understanding of what's going on in the data. An example of that would be the minimum wage debate. So, when I was growing up, and when you were growing up, you're a little older than I am, but we're both somewhat similar generations on this issue. There was no debate. It was an overwhelming consensus by economists. In fact, what made economists distinctive from everyone else was that we thought that minimum wages had a cost. They hurt employment opportunities for low-skilled people. And Card-Krueger came along. They did a state boundary kind of comparison you're talking about. And they found very different effects than the traditional econometric literature. And that spawned an enormous literature suggesting that minimum wage effects are either small or even positive on employment, but mostly close to zero, as a lot of people would argue. I wouldn't, but that's what they say. What do you think of that debate?
Well, it's interesting. That's a very good example, Russell. So let me step back from that for a second. First of all, I think some of the most recent work, for example, a recent paper that Tom McCurdy published in the Journal of Political Economy last spring, suggested that in fact, there are other mechanisms by which firms can respond to higher prices. So, for example, higher wages. And one way, and work also by a student of Card actually at Berkeley, is consistent with this in a minimum wage study in Hungary a few years ago, and that is that firms can actually increase prices. So instead of reducing employment, they can actually increase prices, and if they can pass it along, it really depends on the price elasticity, how inelastic the demand for the final product is. So just from basic economic theory, it's not necessarily always going to be reduction in employment. I mean, that's going to be a force in that direction, but there are other ways that firms can respond to higher cost shocks. So that's one thing on the table. The second thing is, though, if you look at the Card-Krueger analysis and a lot of the subsequent analysis that came from that line of work, I think some of it was fairly casual, and to put it mildly. I don't think the body of work, if you look at some of the work by David Newmark and some of the others, analysts who looked at this quite carefully, I don't think that the large thrust of work is actually saying that minimum wages have no effect on employment. I think that study in particular had certain issues that were pointed out by Newmark and by others, just what else was going on in those two states at that time, how well. This is from the casual observer, you sort of say, okay, I'm on one side of the Delaware River, and you're on the other side. So what you're going to do is say, here's New Hope on one side in Pennsylvania, and then there's a counterpart town just across the river, and those should be pretty similar. But there are a lot of different state policies that are different, and compositions are different, and so it wasn't quite as easy, I think, as people wanted to make from that comparison. So initially it sounded very compelling, but as it got to examine more closely, I think people started thinking, well, maybe there really could be some effects. So in terms of the minimum wage debate, I mean, I think it's still ongoing. I think it's, there are cases theoretically where if your firm is a monopsonist, for example, you might actually change employment. I mean, that's a classic case that was Joan Robinson, I think, had that case or some version of it in the 1930s. But I think more generally, the evidence does suggest that the structure is one towards increasing cost, and then the costs are passed on in what various ways. So I think the debate that you see what was compelling about that, and I will say it was compelling if you read the book, was that it looked at the surface to be very, very nice comparison. It was like a natural experiment. We had an increase on one side, but not on the other side. But also, don't forget that another key point that frequently gets lost is that the range of changes in wages that were being considered in those studies were actually fairly limited. There were fairly small changes in minimum wage. I think if we get to the change of minimum wage, for example, of coverage of Puerto Rico by the U.S. minimum wage in the 1930s, or even now today, we're getting huge increases in the minimum wage, where you're moving the bottom of the distribution up to the median, and that I think would lead. I think any economist, including Card and Kruger, would argue those would be changes that would probably lead to substantial disemployment effects. So see, what I'm saying is that minimum wages are not all the same. Some are bigger, some are smaller. So if I were to tell you that if you smoke one cigarette a day, you're not going to be hurt that much, as opposed to smoking 3 packs a day, I don't think you'd be too surprised. And I think a small change in the minimum wage is not going to have much of an effect. And I think that's been what the findings have been. And David Card, anyway, when he's been asked on this, has said repeatedly that they're talking about modest changes in the minimum wage, which is different from the parameter of saying what happens if I boost the minimum wage by 50%. Their studies don't respond to that. They're just out of the range. And this is the kind of counterfactual, the idea of a policy parameter that we haven't yet seen, except maybe in the case of Puerto Rico, that would be very important to know in designing policy, but that a simple available observational studies and simple experiments won't track. So that's why I think we really have to be very careful. And again, that's the role of economics in associated with interpreting the data. So I think that's the part so coming back to the credibility revolution, I think the part of the incredibility of the incredibility revolution has been its unwillingness to kind of use economic models, even simple economic models. And this is not just an aesthetic appreciation. This is a sense of trying to think about how to interpret and generalize. So the most purely empirical procedure would be to say, I'm going to be purely inductive. I'm only going to look at regularities that I've seen in the past. But the trouble is the world is changing. It's always changing. And we need to try to extract from the past some behavioral regularities that we can use as a guide to interpreting and analyzing policy. I think that's gotten lost, both in the minimum wage debate and the larger issue of the credibility revolution.
Well, let me raise a broader concern that has been a common topic on this program and recently was raised in conversation with Noah Smith. Despite my training at the University of Chicago, and a good chunk of that came at your hands, it's striking to me how rarely econometric evidence is decisive in creating a consensus about public policy or our knowledge about a particular area. And I'm struck by how easy it is for advocates, whether ideological or methodological advocates, to dismiss empirical work as indecisive, flawed, whether it's experimental work, whether it's more traditional econometrics. And where do you think we stand on that? How much progress have we made in accumulating the kind of knowledge that I think you and I both think is the right kind, the sort of the structural relationships that allow us to predict? I'm very skeptical of our ability to do that reliably, given the complexity of the world and the kind of challenges you've been talking about. What do you think of that worry?
Well, I think it's a legitimate worry, and it worries me a lot. I mean, what I worry about is what I think is more generally, not just even about empirical work, is kind of the non-cumulative nature of a lot of work in economics. I'm thinking now more of macroeconomics and microeconomics,
yep,
where we're seeing cycles. We're in some parts of macroeconomics, we're back to the Phillips curve, which was supposed to be dead and buried 40 years ago, and it's now alive and well and blossoming in central banks and public policy discussions in some quarters. So I think part of it is that, and I think part of it comes not from the fact that it's econometric, but I think some of it comes from the fact that look at certain parts of economics just lack data. I mean, that's the fact of the matter. So what is offered as a fact just isn't a fact. So like in the 60s, when I was a graduate student, late 60s, people were talking about the instability of the Phillips curve. There were things called Lipsy loops. And what was happening is the Phillips curve was shifting all around, and people knew that that was an unstable object. And there was a gradual awareness of it, and then some theories were developed to try to explain that instability, which I don't think the theories were ever fully confirmed, but they were at least they at least over a period explained some of the stagflation and some of the instability of macro phenomena. So I do think that there is a group of economists, not insubstantial, that sort of goes through the motions of doing careful empirical work in economics, but either lack the data or lack the integrity or some combination of those two, or less the caution, maybe is the right word, not integrity, to kind of put the data in its context, to say, I really can't say something very strong about this. And this is true for a lot of models. In macroeconomics and other parts of economics, there's a practice called calibration. The calibrated models are models that are kind of looking at some, quote, stylized facts that are putting together different pieces of data that are not mutually consistent. I mean, literally, you take estimates from this area, estimates from that area, and you assemble something that's like a Frankenstein. It then stalks the planet and stalks the profession, walking around. It's got a labor supply parameter from labor economics, and it's got an output elasticity from IO, and on and on and on. And then out comes something, and sometimes a compelling story is told, but it's the story, it's not the data. And I think there's a lack of discipline in some areas where people just don't want to go to primary data sources. And I think you're right, Russell, and it bothers me that what we know as economists is much more limited than many people carry on as if they know. And so I've become aware of that, just the humility of knowledge. The old statement by Hayek, this pretense to knowledge question, which I think is real, that there is a sense in which among professional economists, among professionals generally, you want to show rigorous, carefully reasoned work, which frequently means highly rigorous formal mathematical models. And yet what people are sometimes afraid to admit is just how rough-edged this stuff is. I don't think it's all bad. I think there's some really basic factors that are there, and I think we can learn from them. But I do think that there is kind of a lack of humility in the face of data. But you come back to, you've raised a really important question about, should we then go back to a purely empirical discussion about economics? Should we just let the facts speak for themselves? That is a recurring fallacy. And I remember, if you think back, and I don't remember this, I was a little baby or a little child anyway, but back in the 1940s at Chicago, there was a big debate that broke out. And it was a debate really between Milton Friedman and Charles Koopmans, although it wasn't quite stated that way, it ended up that way. And that was this idea of measurement without theory. Could you do measurement without theory? Arthur Burns, and for that matter, Friedman, were trying to chart the business cycle. Yeah. Burns and Mitchell in particular were trying to chart the business cycle, but using a very atheoretical notions. Very hard to interpret exactly what it is they had and what its relevance was for predicting future. So it led to a big controversy, which continues to this day, measurement without theory. And so it's very appealing to say, let's not let the theory get in the way. We have all the facts. We should look at facts. We should basically have a structure that is free of a lot of arbitrary theory and a lot of arbitrary structure. That's very appealing. I would like it. The idea that we have this purely inductive, Francis Bacon-like style, not the painter, but the original philosopher. But the problem with that is, as Koopmans pointed out, and as people have pointed out, that every fact is subject to multiple interpretations. You've got to place it in context. So it's not like, I think what it is, see, this is a case of reaction, overreaction. So there are these rigidly specified models that nobody believes. I think that's true. Somebody comes along and says, I'm gonna do this, I'm gonna do that. And then, even though that's very appealing, and it shows kind of a lot of ergs of energy and a lot of brain power, nobody believes them because they're not robust. But on the other hand, if somebody comes along and says, see, here's a simple fact. Like we were just saying, wage inequality has gone up, right? And household inequality has gone up. Therefore, the economic system is failing. Well, think about what we were just saying earlier. The family is changing. That's a fact. That's a matter of interpretation.
A different fact.
A different fact. But then you ask, well, why is the family changing? That's a deeper question. But the fact is that every one of these, there's no such thing as an unadorned objective fact. It's somehow out there in the universe as this true fact. And there have been a lot of controversies, and the literature will continue long past our lifetime. So people will say, let the facts speak for themselves. But in fact, the facts almost never fully speak for themselves. But they do speak. And so the question is just to be, sensitive to the facts and to interpret them in ways that allow us to be more robust. So I'd say in a lot of areas of economics, we have less knowledge than we think we have. So I think there is a pretense to knowledge. I think there's a lot less than we really think, than many people think they know. I think, you look at conventions. I remember Dale Mortensen, the famous economist at Northwestern who got a Nobel Prize for his work on search theory. He and I were going to a conference together in Spain many years ago, and I remember we were on the plane. We had a good chance to talk about a lot of things, and he was reporting estimates of the numbers. And I said, and he's giving some numbers, and I said, well, Dale, I don't know these numbers. I said, do you think that if I wasn't running with the club here, and I just kind of did my own independent research, that I would come up with your numbers? And he smiled and laughed. No. We all agree that this is that, and I guess progress is made that way, and I'm willing to go along with that progress, but I think one has to have a certain humility, and I just have to know that, we know a lot less than we think we know, but we do know something. So I think you're right, that in some sense, it's better to kind of be aware of the limitations, but in the end, we still need a framework of interpretation, and so even Friedman, who was on kind of the other side of the Burns and Mitchell, favoring kind of letting the data speak for themselves, Friedman in all of his work used very basic, very sound, very basic economic models to interpret the evidence. Permanent income is a great example. And some of his work even on monetary theory, and quantity theory. And so I think every successful body of social science has used basic models, but they've gotten to kind of the core of the idea, not bells and whistles. And bells and whistles are kind of second generation, third generation add-ons. That becomes very, very professionally, privately rewarding, maybe not so rewarding for the subject as a contributor to economic knowledge generally and to public policy. But I do think economists have contributed, I think there was an appreciation, right, after all this effort. It's not fully appreciated, but gradually people are starting to use the fruits of the Boskin Commission and some of the other commissions that looked at the effect of product quality on the consumer price index level. And I think people are adjusting. There's still arguments about the actual magnitude, but I think that was an economic principle, very simple, well documented, and that kind of made its way into the mainstream. So I think if you think about it, 70 years ago, there were no current population survey data. There weren't the kind of information we have that today dominates the headlines every few months when somebody finds a new fact. Wages have gone up, wages have gone down, employment of blacks has decreased, or this or that. So I think we have a much richer data system, but I think we also have to supplement it with an interpretive system. Otherwise, we're just going to have blind facts that can be interpreted in any which way.
And I worry a lot about the biases we all have and how hard it is to judge those facts objectively when you don't have a theory. And, of course, we do have a theory. It's just in the background. It'd be better to me to make it out, put it out in the open.
But the best way to do that is not necessarily that just everybody agree on one theory. Sometimes it's good to have very competing theories.
Absolutely.
But stating their views in a very open way and then letting people decide. But sometimes the debate can get very, very complex. And even think of the discussions about derivatives and the financial asset regulation. Sometimes for the average person, even for a lot of average economists who aren't trained in finance, those discussions can get very technical, and they probably can't contribute very well or even understand it well. So there's a sense there's also another sense, which is that parts of economics are hard. And if we were just a little more careful ourselves and had higher standards, I think people might be willing to defer more than they do now, the average person out there in the world, to economists if we had a little more internal policing about what we did within specific fields.
Yeah. I'm curious. You talked about the Hayekian. I think of it as Hayekian humility.
Yes.
Has that changed over your lifetime in your career? And for me, when I was younger, I was a lot more confident. I was pretty sure that, as I've said before here, I was pretty sure that my guys did the good studies and the other side had the bad studies. And it was a very painful recognition at one point to realize that actually the other side actually cares deeply, is trying their hardest, and they suffer from the same cognitive challenges my side suffers from. And their data's flawed, and our data's flawed, and our models are not so robust. Has that been part of your mindset for a long time, or is it something that you've come to as you've gotten older?
Well, I think that's a general process of aging. If you do empirical work, as I do, and you get into issues, you're inevitably confronted with your own failures of perception and your own blind sides. And I think the profession as a whole is probably better, much better now. I mean, the whole enterprise is bigger to start with, so you're getting a lot of diverse points of view, and the whole capacity of the profession to replicate, to simulate, to check other people's studies has become much greater than it was in the past. I think a big development that's occurred inside economics, and it's in economics journals, and it's in the professional, that if people put out a study, except for having those studies based on proprietary data, that many studies essentially have to be out there and to be replicated. And it's literally been the kiss of death for people not to allow others to replicate their data. And that's a good sign. I think that's a really good sign. I don't think that would have been true 50 years ago to the same extent it is now. So I think the whole profession's into replication, into basically trying more closely to look more deeply at what other sides are going on. So I think we're in a better position to actually check each other. And I think that's a major improvement. So I think that's been a drift independent of my private aging. But I also have this sense that when I was younger, I certainly think, but don't forget, I grew up, I came of age, if you will, in the late 60s. And at that time, there was this hubris. I think it was a hubris that I think was more centered in macro than micro. And it certainly influenced my thinking, though, that you could basically control the business cycle. You could use econometric models to predict a lot of things. And then all that started unraveling within my lifetime, even my early lifetime. And people started questioning, can we do this? I mean, the original Klein-Brookings model that was put out in the 60s, I remember as a graduate student reading that it had, all these equations, more equations and more parameters, and it had instrumental variables and than it had any kind of credibility. And the systems weren't even mutually consistent, the equations. And then the final blow came when a friend of mine, a professor who's a little bit older, ended up working for Klein and pointing out how did Klein's model predict so well? Because when Klein got predictions from his econometric model, he would then adjust it using his insights.
Yeah.
So it wasn't like some triumph of econometrics. This was basically triumph of Klein's common sense. So I think the whole profession probably went overboard in the 60s and 70s maybe about the ability of economic models to predict. And I think that led to the backlash that's now we think of as the credibility revolution. And I think that, yes, I think we've all come to recognize the limits of the data. But on the other hand, I think we should also be amazed at how much richer the database is these days, how much more we can actually investigate. For example, we can look at aspects of time use surveys. We can look at aspects of surveys of individuals incarcerated. We can look at trends in areas. We have very detailed scanner data, which allow us to look at transactions at stores, individual transactions, to identify kind of what quality changes are, how to adjust price indices. So even though we've got a long ways to go, I think we've gone a long way too, way back from the 1920s and 30s when there were almost no U.S. aggregate economic or microeconomic data. Now we have a large body of it. So I think the empirical side of economics is much healthier than it was long before, going back to the 20s and 30s. That was just a period with no data. So I think we have a better understanding of the economy than we did, and I think that's still there. And I think we have better interpretive frameworks than we had out there. And I think, understanding the non-market sector, thinking more broadly about demographic trends within and appreciating them. I think these are things that I think we shouldn't overlook here and understate where we've come from. We've come a long way.
Talk about your mentors, your influences, your intellectual influences when you were younger and certainly today.
Well, when I was young, I had some very good colleagues at Princeton. I certainly was influenced by people like Richard Quant and then some younger people you wouldn't know so well, people like Harry Collegian, who was now in Maryland, retired, and Stanley Black. These are people who interacted with me. Orly Ashenfelder was a graduate student with me when I was at Princeton, but he's a couple years older than I am. But we interacted a lot, and as peers, we were both feeling our oats. And there was this econometric revolution where we could literally say, oh, look, in labor economics, there was almost no application of consumer theory in terms of econometrics. So we would read Tile's books on consumer demand and apply it to estimating labor supply. And so there was a lot of excitement. And at Princeton, William Bowen was doing a study of the labor market, which was at that time very, very new, just a factual study. But over my lifetime, some of the great influences, probably some of the people who've influenced me the most have been some of my colleagues here at Chicago. And I would put Gary Becker first and foremost in that. I came in, a young guy, anxious to prove myself, and like a lot of people, very interested in Gary Becker's work, and I found it fascinating and humbling. So I had Jacob Mincer as my first colleague at Columbia, my first job, and I kept in close touch with him throughout his life, and also then Gary Becker, with whom I interacted, and we taught classes and shared seminars and so forth. So I felt those two were important mentors, but I felt also, for example, in macroeconomics, people like, I don't want to say mentors, I probably quit getting a mentor years ago, but I've interacted with people like Bert Singer, who's actually not even an economist, but he's a statistician, and but I would say a polymath who has a range of ideas, and we've interacted broadly over a whole range of topics. He's gotten interested in economics. I've gotten interested in topics and statistics. We wrote some econometrics papers together. And then in macro, I found some of the greatest stimulus being from Lars Hansen, who, even though we've written a few papers together, but Lars has an incredible range of skills. And my general group of high-quality colleagues at Chicago, they're very, very good. And early on, when I came to Chicago, Friedman was still running workshops, and I treasured the time when I first came here of being able to go out to dinner once a week with Friedman, and he came to lunch conversations, and we had all these great discussions. So Friedman, Stigler, and Becker, those three people were very good. Robert Barrow was here. There were a lot of exchanges, some of them fierce, but some of them very good, and all of them with intensity. So I felt that the whole structure of colleagues here, William Brock, who was at the time here as a theorist, very heavily engaged. But look, when I arrived here, there had a lot of just activity going on, and I don't want to say it's mentoring, but I had people like Merton Miller and Myron Scholes, and you could go down a long list of very good. Greg Lewis was still here at that time. I inherited one of his classes and interacted with him for a while in labor economics, and then gradually, and then Lucas arrived, and there was stimulation in that front, both positive and negative at times, but sort of feeling. I always felt there was macro should be a little more careful than it was, but nonetheless, I felt that I got a lot of stimulating ideas. So between the business school here, the law school, Coase was over at the law school, Posner and Landis and and Coase were actually very active at the Stigler workshop, the Law and Economics workshop, which was half IO and half Law and Economics. And so I remember many stimulating workshops. And so I could go through a long list of people that I found stimulating and have continued, plus the students. I mean, getting students like you, getting students like McCurdy, we talked about earlier, other students. I've had a whole host of students who, in some sense, have mentored me. I mean, they've challenged me with questions. They've forced me to rethink issues. They're my best critics, and they're frequently sources of ideas, mutual. I can sometimes help them. They can help me. But, you know, the whole atmosphere of Chicago has traditionally been give and take, exchange, and people making back and forth. And I think that back and forth has really been an integral part of my own training. So I kind of, when I got here to Chicago, I really became very enthusiastic about the structure of the place, and it was hard not to get caught up. And, you know, at one point, there was a very famous economist here, now long dead and probably mostly forgotten, named Harry Johnson.
Oh, yeah.
Harry Johnson, a trade economist. So he had a huge influence on me at the time. He actually was a Keynesian, kind of opposed to Friedman. So Friedman and Johnson were both here. There was a little bit of unpleasantness about it because Johnson had written this paper claiming that Friedman had falsely characterized the history of the quantity theory in Chicago. But the fact of the matter is they were both very bright, and they would exchange ideas. And it wasn't like I was caught between them. I could actually get stimulated by both of them. And they were both very open to me. And I really found I learned a lot about a lot of different things from them. So it was a very exciting place. And it still is. I mean, it's just the generations change. And I mentioned some pretty tall timber there, but to me, it was very stimulating. Just the whole range of it. To go to the Stigler workshop, for example, and see this range of ideas. I literally, the first year I was here, or I guess it was the second year I was teaching here, I actually became aware of this work. And Posner had written a book called The Economic Analysis of the Law. And so I used that as a textbook, actually, in a course in price theory for undergraduates. And it just really stimulated all the undergraduates, you know.
Sure.
And at that time, I remember talking to Landis, Posner, and Coase, and so all these ideas were in flux, and we could argue back and forth about this, that, or the other thing. So in that sense, it was really tremendously. But it was the case, though, that with dealing with Friedman raised, for me, some of my first concerns about what you want to call the credibility revolution. So I remember telling him about some work that I was doing. And as you remember, some of the work I was doing was very complicated for its time.
Sure.
Computation.
Oh, yeah.
I remember I was sitting in Becker's house, and I told Friedman about what I was doing. He looked at me and said, looked at me just straight on, bluntly. He said, it looks like in that kind of work, there's lots of room for fraud. And I looked at it, and, I said, well, yes, deliberate or maybe not so deliberate. And he agreed. And he's right. There was a lack of reproducibility. So Friedman was onto the credibility question. And it was the delicate. So it sent chills down my spine, but I also recognized that he was right.
My guest today has been James Heckman. Jim, thanks for being part of Econ Talk.
Okay, well, thanks for having me.
This is Econ Talk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more Econ Talk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for Econ Talk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.